guys, it's Stephanie, and I wanted to do kind of a mini wrap up to talk about how my November reading has been going, because it has been going really well. I always want to participate in nonfiction November, but I'm sure you guys all know that I hit my October horror reading pretty hard, so that I usually find myself needing a little bit more of a break in November. I, unfortunately this year, kind of went through a little bit of a slump. Like, I still read a lot of books, but I just found that I DNF'd a lot and a lot of stuff just wasn't working for me. So I felt really refreshed in November, and I felt like I was really able to give nonfiction November the attention that I always wanted to give it. So that was really exciting. So I didn't just read nonfiction so far. I have read 3 nonfiction books so far. I think 2 of them and they have fit 3 of the challenges, and I do plan on reading more that probably won't fit in the challenges, but I don't think that's really the point. As Olive and Gemma has said, it's just to make a point to pick up more nonfiction. The first book I picked up was I'd rather be reading, I think it's like The Dilemmas of the Reader Life by Anne Bogel. So I listened to this as an audiobook, and maybe I should have read it in its physical form because I think it's an aesthetically pleasing book. I think it's a little more of a coffee table book, and I kind of felt like it was that way listening to it. So I didn't quite get along with this. It felt like she just introduced a lot of topics and really didn't go into them. A few months ago I read Dear Fahrenheit 451, which was about a woman who wrote letters to the books that she loved, and I really enjoyed that. So I enjoy nonfiction about people's relationship with books and reading. But I love when that comes from a place where there's a lot of personal anecdotes, where you get really specific and talk about books you love and why, and how that book changed your life, and what books did this and why. And I think with Anne Bogel's book is that she was very general, and she just kind of said, like, isn't it crazy when this happens? And then maybe put a little bit of a personal anecdote, but I felt like she never got too personal. And maybe this was in an attempt to reach a broader audience. With Anne Bogel's book, I really felt as a reader like I was being held at arm's length, and it really was off-putting, and I felt like I really couldn't get to know her, and she really didn't get into depth about any of the things she was talking about, unfortunately. So I wanted to like this book a little more. I can see how this would work as a coffee table book that you would have. The second book I read was A Circle of Quiet, and this is part of the Crossweek's Journals by Madeleine L'Engle, and this is Madeleine L'Engle's kind of memoir, kind of journal, kind of just outlet for her thoughts. So I was really interested with this. I would say reading this almost felt like I was having lunch with my grandmother, and she was just talking to me about her life and her experiences. This felt just very warm. I will say, like, this is not for everyone. She is very religious, and this is a book about her personal musings and her influences. So I think going into this, you do need to know that that's going to play a big part of that, because that is a big part of her life and a big part of something that she struggled with for a long time and that she was alienated by. I would say the parts of this that I found most interesting were the parts, you know, that I came in to read, which were what her life was like, and about getting A Wrinkle in Time published, and how she had a hard time getting it published because people said it was too advanced for that kind of audience, or like too weird and it didn't make sense, and how there was a publisher who did take a chance on her and she finally did get it published, and you know, it won a lot of acclaim. I'll say the only downside with this is that there really wasn't a structure, because this is basically a journal, and just like I said, her musings, they just kind of go all over the place. She'll start telling you about this, but then talk about when she was a girl and some stories she had there, and then jump forward and talk about her and her husband, and then talk about some philosophy thing, and then talk about like kids nowadays. It's very, I wouldn't quite say it was stream of consciousness, but there isn't a strict structure to it. It definitely is a journal. So that was Crossweek's Journals number 1. I think there's 4. This one was A Circle of Quiet. The next book I read was Exorcist Falls by Donovan, just totally, completely swerving into another lane. This was flat out horror. So this book, when you buy it, is actually a novella and then a novel. So the novella is Exorcist Road, and then it moves on to Exorcist Falls. So this follows 2 priests that get called to do an exorcism on a teenage boy in Chicago. And so they get called to the house, they see the teenage boy, they see his family, there's some police officers there, but also along with the possession, there's also been a serial killer on the loose called the Sweet 16 Killer, who has been killing girls that are 16 years old. And the people have reason to believe that the teenage boy who is possessed might possibly also be the Sweet 16 killer. There is so much that happens in this story, and unfortunately I can't get into it because let's just say that in the novella Exorcist Road, you find out who the Sweet 16 killer is. Exorcist Falls takes place like literally hours after the events of Exorcist Road, and I just thought it was very well written. It took a turn that I was not expecting. I think the author handled it so well where when there was information revealed, you thought to yourself, like, how did I not see this the whole time? Like, it was so obvious, and I can't believe I didn't put those pieces together. But it's because the author did a good job of really guiding you through exactly what he wanted you to see and believe. And I just thought that was so well done and just such a fun moment as a reader, like when you're reading a thriller and a mystery and you're actually shocked and surprised. But at the same time, knowing that this just didn't come out of nowhere, like this was the work of someone who is a skilled storyteller. And then Exorcist Falls just gets so crazy. There are scenes in that book that I still think about. I think this would make a really good movie. So speaking of things that are getting made into films soon, I read Stephen King's Pet Sematary for the first time. I had been putting it off, number one, because I had seen the movie, and I have a hard time reading things when I've already seen the movie, and two, because despite the fact that I love horror and I even run a horror book podcast, Stephen King is very hit or miss for me. But another reason that I was putting off reading this is because I have a small child, and the events in this book revolve around the death of a small child, one who gets run over by a truck. So, as the parent of a small child, I tend to avoid things that are basically my greatest fears. Which I know, like, you think I read a lot of horror, you read things that are gonna scare me, but not like that scare me. This follows a family that moves to Maine. The husband has just gotten a job working at a local university as like the campus doctor. They're really excited to move into this house, and they realize that the house is in front of a kind of main highway that is a route for truckers, and there's constantly semis like roaring past their house. And so they get settled in, and they meet Judd, the neighbor across the street, and he talks to them, really welcomes them in, but he also shows them this pet cemetery that he says the neighborhood kids, you know, keep up. It's just really eerie. It's like where kids go to bury their dead pets. But the family has a young daughter and a really young son named Gage. I think horror works best when there's a strong human emotion attached. That's why I think horror works very well with the topic of grief. And I think especially with the case of like what people are willing to do instead of grieving or accepting a loss. And I thought it worked really well on those fronts. There were scenes here that really gave me chills. I don't think it was perfect. I thought the relationship with the main character, Lewis, and his father-in-law was a little over the top and had me rolling my eyes at points. I thought his wife, Rachel, was a little underdeveloped as a character. But I will say, usually I have a problem with Stephen King endings, and this is one that I think he absolutely nailed. So far this might be one of my favorite Stephen King endings so far. The next book I read was an anthology called Hark, The Herald Angels Scream, and this was edited by Christopher Golden. And as you can imagine, these are horror short stories that all revolve around Christmas or are set on Christmas, and there was a lot of really good ones in here. Like most anthologies, I love to see the take that the authors do on whatever the theme is. And so I think one of my favorites was, shoot, I'm trying to remember what it was called. I think it was called Good Deeds by Jeff Strand, but it's basically, all I'm going to say is it's about the Christmas Shoes song. I just thought it did a really good job of being equal parts horrifying and hilarious while making commentary on what is possibly the worst song of all time. And what I think was probably the standout story in this collection was called Yankee Swap, and we are following a pregnant woman who is at an office Christmas party, and she's being hit on by her like gross frat boy boss. But then she finds herself in a little bit of a situation, and unfortunately that's all I can say because it's a short story. So I definitely suggest, if you pick it up, even if you only read 2 stories, I would suggest those 2 stories. So the next book I listened to was Sadie by Courtney Summers. I know a lot of people have said this, but I 100% suggest doing it as an audiobook because the way the narrative is told, it's like one half true crime podcast, one half like narrative. And we're following a girl named Sadie. Her younger sister ran away from home and was murdered. One half of the story is this like radio show, a podcast guy who is interviewing Sadie's family about Sadie's disappearance and what they think happened, and really getting into the story of these two girls and where they came from. And really kind of this human interest, you know, they're the focus of this season type of story. And then in the other chapters, you are following Sadie, and she's on a mission to find out what happened to her sister. I thought it was really well done. You are following Sadie. Sadie is such a good character. So she is a young girl with a vendetta, but I thought Courtney Summers did a really good job of fleshing out her character. I really felt for her in so many times in this book. And I think with a lot of stories like this, they make the main character this invincible, infallible person that you never have any doubt is gonna complete her mission or go through with it. But there were so many times here where she would get herself in a situation and I was genuinely like scared for her, and you genuinely saw moments of weakness that she had, or her making a wrong decision, or things just like not quite working out the way they planned. She wasn't this infallible, like I'm one step ahead of you person all the time. She also struggles to communicate because she has a stutter, which makes it hard for her to, you know, literally communicate with people, but also makes it hard for people to forget her. So when the podcast guy is on her trail and he is interviewing people about her, they do know who she is. I will say, my one issue I had with this was some of the dialogue, I think especially in Sadie's part, was a little, it felt canned, it felt very scripted. Like there is a scene where she goes up to a dangerous guy, and he says, I forget he says, but it's a line like, haven't you ever heard of like a fool's errand? She says like, maybe I am a fool. And I think my whole deal with that was like, who talks like that? And also like it didn't feel cool, unless like that was the thing. Like, you know, in books and movies, people always say like these cool one-liners, but in real life, like that doesn't happen. And when you say stuff like that, it's just weird and it doesn't land the way you think it's going to land. So unless that was her point that she was trying to make, some of the dialogue I thought on her part was really cringy. And like when she was trying to be like a cool chick. But other than that, I really recommend it. I was very invested in this story, emotionally and just completely. And so that is Sadie by Courtney Summers. And the last book I read was for Nonfiction November, and that is It's All a Game by Tristan Donovan. The subtitle is The History of Board Games from Monopoly to Settlers of Catan. And so this is the book on the history of board games, and I thought it was so interesting. So the way this is split up is each chapter is about a specific board game. So there's like a chess chapter, a checkers chapter, like a Scrabble chapter, a life chapter, a, you know, etc., etc. And he goes in and finds, you know, little nuggets of history where he can. And with the more modern games, you know, the ones that have come out within the last century, he really gets into like who invented it, like what was going on at the time, how did it do when it was finally sold, what was the appeal of it, why does it have certain elements that it has. So for example, the history of the board game Life is absolutely fascinating because it was based on this basically very religious morality game from the 19th century. You know, you would put your board, and if you lived like a sinful life, you would pay for it. But if you did like good things, you would get a reward for it. And so you would get on a thing that it was like, you did something on the Sabbath, like head to the whipping post. And I'm not kidding, that was something that was on here. And so Milton Bradley kind of took that thing and made kind of a prototype of life, how like there were a certain path you could take and you would get certain things for it, and you're kind of living life. But what I thought was interesting was the reason that it has the spinner and not dice is because I believe Milton Bradley was a very strict Episcopalian, and you're supposed to like really stray away from the appearance of evil, and in this case gambling, so he didn't want his game to have dice so that it would still appeal to a religious crowd. And then in the chapter he talks about like the different iterations that it's taken as it's gone over, because you know, you used to not have a choice of like whether you got married, and really the only choice was like, do you go into a career or do you go to college? And going through a time where like every achievement you had some monetary value that you would get, and money ended up being the main goal, to, you know, a new iteration where, you know, happiness and fulfillment is more of the goal of the game of life. And just very fascinating So I would really recommend this. I would say the only thing was I wish there was something that kind of tied everything together, because everyone was like, well, anyway, this was happening, this is the person, here's something about the game, you know, next chapter is the next game. So that is It's All a Game by Tristan Donovan. I am losing my voice. So anyway, guys, that is all the stuff I have read so far for November. Talk to me in the comments about any of these books, and thank you so much for watching. I hope to see you again soon. Bye!